You're tuned into the Spot Up Pod, the official podcast of the Spot Up Shot newsletter. I'm your host, Paul Garcia. In today's episode, the Spurs get a split in France with the Pacers. The Spurs threw 43 games this season. Looking at the Spurs' recent pattern of blowout losses, should the Spurs clear some roster space for next season at the trade deadline coming up in a week and a half? Wemby was almost named a West All-Star starter, and then I'm going to preview the Spurs' upcoming 3 games for this week. All right, so let's begin with the Spurs' games this past week. They only had 2 games. They were both in Paris against the Indiana Pacers. So this one went kind of how I thought it would in my preview from last week. If you go back and listen to last week's episode, I thought that the Spurs would win the first game with a lot of support from the French crowd. Wemby would have a big night, and sure enough, that happened. They had a good win. But then the second game, I thought that the Pacers would make some adjustments. Sure enough, that did happen. However, I didn't think the Spurs would get blown out, but they ended up getting blown out in that second game. So I want to go through each game in more detail here and kind of just recap what happened in these games. So let's go back to Thursday. The Spurs, as I mentioned, are in Paris, France, playing against the Indiana Pacers. The Pacers, I will say, were favored by 2.5 points. The Spurs welcomed back Jeremy Sohan to the lineup. He came off the bench. So it was close in the first half. The Spurs took over, though, in the third quarter, where they outscored the Pacers 45-23, and they ended up holding on to that lead to win by 30 points. They ended a season-high 3-game losing streak with this win, and this is now the third time where the Spurs have faced a 3-game losing streak, and they've always ended it on that 4th game, so that was a good sign for San Antonio. The Spurs pretty much did what other teams have been doing to them, where they, in that third quarter, they came out as the aggressor defensively. They forced a lot of turnovers, and the Pacers had a cold shooting third quarter, and the Spurs, used more transition offense, where the Pacers had a tough time getting into their half court defense, and so the Spurs took advantage there. And so the Spurs had a really good night on this game on Thursday in France, where they shot they matched their season best in 3-point accuracy, making 50% of their threes. They scored a lot of points in the paint. They also notched up a season-high 43 assists in this game. They scored 34 fast break points and 140 points they put on the scoreboard, which were also both season highs. Wemby shined in front of his home crowd of France, where he ends up with 30 points, 11 rebounds, 6 assists, and 5 blocks in 32 minutes. He had a really big, some big plays in the third quarter where he goes and gets a block, makes a play on the other end, goes back and gets a block, makes a play on the other end, goes back and gets a block and makes a play on the other end. So it was just I put some film together over on the spotupshot.com if you want to see that. And then in the fourth, he had another crazy play where it looks like Tyrese Halliburton's guarding him and he's kind of like stopped his dribble. No, Wemby throws it off the glass, goes back up and just dunks it in midair. And so yeah, he had a spectacular night for the French crowd there. With the game that he had. Devin Vassell had another really good game with 25 points. It was his 5th straight game scoring 20 or more. And he also added some defensive plays with 2 steals and 2 blocks. And then Harrison Barnes had a good night on this night with 20 points on just 10 shot attempts. And the Spurs also got good games from Jeremy Sohan and Trey Jones pushing the pace, making defensive plays there off the bench. And then Sandro Mamukelashvili got some first half minutes, and he played alongside Victor there, Mamu playing the 4. So again, that was a good night on Thursday for the Spurs in France. So it looked like, yes, they ended their losing streak. Everything was going well. And then Saturday made it seem like almost like it was a mirage, where some of the trends that they left America with arrived with them in France on Saturday, which is those pattern of blowout losses. So let's talk about what happened here. So it's Saturday in France. For those of us in America, it was a very early tip-off. So the Pacers, again, were favored by 2.5. I will say that. Indiana was favored. Both teams were healthy. They had all their rotation players available. This time, the Pacers came out, right from the jump, playing more aggressive defense, applying a lot more full court pressure, getting the Spurs to turn the ball over. And so basically, Indiana held a 15-point lead going into halftime. Then, early in the third quarter, the Pacers pushed their lead all the way to 17. However, the Spurs did charge back. They were guided by Harrison Barnes and Stephon Castle, really putting pressure on the rim, getting to the free throw line. And so the Spurs actually took a 1-point lead. What was interesting, though, was that Coach Mitch Johnson hadn't put in the bench unit. It was almost like 3 minutes left in the quarter, and he really didn't want to go to the bench group because that starting group was doing a really good job of getting back into the game. Sure enough, when he had to put the bench group back in or put some players off the bench in, the Spurs lost that lead, and they also just struggled. They got outscored 17-6 at the end of the third quarter. Tyrese Halliburton had a crazy sequence, scoring a bunch of buckets, especially from 3. And so basically the Pacers went into the fourth quarter leading by 12 points. And then in the fourth quarter, things just went off the tracks, I guess you would say, for San Antonio. They got outscored 38-12. They only scored 12 points in the entire quarter. Turnovers, cold shooting led to a combination of those issues. And then basically they ended up losing this game by 38 points, which is their largest loss of the season when we talk about just total points. Harrison Barnes had another good night, 25 points for the Spurs. Like I mentioned, he had a big third quarter there, he and Steph Castle. Wemby ends up with 20 points on 16 shots. 12 rebounds, 2 steals, and 1 block. The 2 things the Pacers did. First, on offense, for Victor, they still had Miles Turner mainly guarding him, but they also had some other different players. But one thing they were doing was they were just keeping full court pressure on Wemby and a lot of the other Spurs players, and so they always had a player by his side, and they were letting him get a lot of wide open threes either. So he went 2 of 7 from 3. So that was on the offensive end where he couldn't really get going as much, even though he did end up taking 16 shots. On the defensive end, we see there that he only had 1 block in this game, and one thing they do is they play a lot of pick and roll heavy offenses, the Pacers, and the Spurs, what they like to do is switch that action. And so a lot of times Victor ended up like on Andrew Nembhard or Tyrese Halliburton up top, and so basically he was too far away from the rim, and the Pacers were just way more aggressive. Nembhard set the tone here of basically trying to attack inside, and so if Wemby's way up top by the 3-point line, that left the rim vulnerable, and so the Pacers did get a lot of paint points, and so Victor only ended up with 1 block because of how the Pacers devised their offense to pull him away from the rim. Stephon Castle bounced back with a better game here with 17 points on 20 shots, still a lot more shots. He ends up with collecting a career-high 6 rebounds. He got 6 assists and also 12 paint points, kind of that same pattern we see from him where he scores double digits in the paint whenever it's a game where he's a starter, where he gets more minutes, basically. He's more likely to get a good night scoring the basketball in the paint. And then, unfortunately for Devin Vassell, he had a tough night, just 6 points. He didn't take as many shots. I will say that. I think part of that was that Castle and Barnes were way more aggressive, so maybe there weren't as many shots there for Vassell. So his streak of 5 games in a row at 20 or more points ended, where he ends up with just 6 points. Keldon Johnson only scored 4 points, and the Spurs are expecting bigger numbers from him. However, he only played 11 minutes. Again, like I mentioned, it almost seemed like Coach Johnson at times was hesitant to even put in any bench players. He just liked what the starting group was doing, and that kind of shows that, the Spurs aren't, the bench isn't bringing a lot for San Antonio right now, if that's what the case looked like. Jeremy Sohan only played 14 minutes as well. He scored just 2 points with 4 turnovers, so again, he didn't get a lot of minutes as well. And it goes back to what Keldon's situation, where Coach Johnson just didn't look like he wanted to bring anyone in off the bench at times. And then Mamu continued to get some rotation minutes, especially alongside Victor there at the 4. And I will just say, after last week's games where the Spurs struggled against Memphis and against Miami, where those teams were specifically having a big guard players like Castle or like Keldon, Cherry Jones, basically to shrink the space inside. It does look interesting that the coaching staff now is giving Mamu some real minutes, and because of that likely threat that he is to make a 3. I know he hasn't made one since he's been getting minutes, but I definitely, if you just watch him off the ball, the player guarding him on the weak side is definitely a little bit closer than they would be to guarding someone like Stephon Castle or Trey Jones, right? So I think that's one adjustment the coaching staff has definitely made, is they're trying to get Mamu more minutes at the 4 alongside Victor to bring about more spacing, because like I've talked about numerous times here on the Spot Up Pod, the Spurs just don't have a lot of dangerous 3-point shooters that defenses are scared of, and so maybe Mamu's one of those players that they're going to start bringing in there into these games. So Vegas did say the Spurs should have gone 0-2. They actually defied those odds. They went 1-1. But like I said, the way it ended is it felt more like a mirage, where yes, they won that game by 30 points, but then on Thursday, but then on Saturday, they end up going back into those losses of getting blown out in games. And that was something that I'm going to talk about a little bit more in detail here later on in this episode. All right, so now that the Spurs have completed 43 games, let's go ahead and take a look at how they are doing this season. So they are 20-23 through 43 games, now 3 games below 500 again. There are just 39 games left in the season. They're 12th out west as of Sunday afternoon that I'm recording this episode. They're 2 games behind the Kings, who are 23-22, and the Kings are currently 10th. They're in the play-in picture. So basically, to have a better record than the Kings by the end of the year, if both these teams stay on this kind of pace, or the Kings stay on this kind of pace, the Spurs would need to go 21-18 the rest of the way to finish with a better record based on the current Kings' record. So again, that's 21-18 of these final 39 is what the Spurs need to do to have a better record to basically jump into that 10th spot in the play-in picture. Per Cleaning the Glass, the Spurs are, though, on pace for just 34.8 wins, which is good. I mean, compared to what they were at last year, where they only won 22 wins. I mean, winning 35 games is pretty good. That's kind of where I projected them to be, and where maybe like Vegas did as well. But it's not going to be enough to get them in the play-in picture if that ends up happening. So they will have to outperform those expectations. Speaking of outperforming expectations, Cleaning the Glass has a model where they basically project how many wins you should have based on your statistical production. And right now, they're saying the Spurs should only have 18 wins right now, which means that the fact that the Spurs have 20 wins means they've actually outperformed their statistical model. So the Spurs are actually playing a little bit better basketball overall. I know right now they're struggling overall than what the model there says. It's not going to be easy to go 21 and 18 the rest of the way because, according to Positive Residual, they do have the 8th toughest schedule left in the NBA, but they don't have the toughest schedule out west. According to Positive Residual's model, the Suns, the Pelicans, the Grizzlies, the Lakers, and the Kings all have a tougher schedule than the Spurs going down the stretch of this season. Offensively, the Spurs are now 18th. Defensively, they've slipped to 19th, and then their net rating is at 20th. The same pattern kind of still stays in progress where they're losing the first quarter, the second quarter, and the fourth quarter. They're winning the third quarter still. They're still a top 10 team in third quarter net rating, but I will say that has been an issue in some of these blowout losses where it's not always reliable that they're going to win the third quarter. And then in the math game, they are being outscored still by twos by 192 points. They're barely holding on to that 3-point lead battle, I guess you would say. They're a +6 on threes, so they've just made 2 more threes total than their opponent. And then they're still winning the free throw line pretty well, +120 on free throws, which makes them a -66 for the season. All right, so for the first topic, what I want to talk about is something I wrote about on the spotupshot.com in that game recap of the Spurs' loss to the Pacers on Saturday, game 43. I kind of put some of these numbers in here, but I kind of want to expand on that of what's going on here with the pattern of blowout losses. So that's what we're going to talk about here. So in their last 7 games, the Spurs are 2-5. Of those 2 wins against the Lakers and the Pacers, they've actually had blowout wins. So that's been nice for San Antonio. They won by 24 against the Lakers, and then they won by 30 against the Pacers. But in the losses, in those 5 losses, they've all been by double digits, and there has been a pattern where they're pretty close in first halves, and then all of a sudden, either the third quarter or the fourth quarter or a mixture of both quarters, they're getting blown out there in those final 24 minutes is where the issue has been. So one thing we do know is that, the Spurs, for almost the entire half the season, 49% of their games this season, they have trailed by 15 points. But early in the season, we saw that even when they fell behind by a lot of points, by 15 points, they usually battled back. Maybe they didn't win, but they actually made it a more respectable loss. But what we're seeing here is that lately in these last 7 games, they're completely getting blown out, and that's one thing they were staying away from early on in the season. So they've only faced 7 25-point deficits this season, but they've been behind by 25 or more now in 4 of their last 7 games. So again, before this streak, it was only 3 times that they had been behind by 25 points before these last 7 games, and now all of a sudden it's happened 4 times in these last 7 games where they've fallen behind by 25 points. Something Coach Johnson mentioned last week was that one part of it is that they are playing better teams, and so those teams have exposed some issues for the Spurs lately. Some of the issues I have mentioned here on the Spot Up Pod, and I've also written about on the spotupshot.com in detail with some film as well, is how some of these better teams are just making the Spurs struggle on offense to get more opportunity to get out and transition on defense, and that's where the Spurs are struggling with their transition defense, and it's usually happening after these teams are making big adjustments in the second half of games, and that's where we really see that teams are backing off certain players, shrinking the floor inside, making things tough on the Spurs on offense, and then that forces San Antonio to miss or turn it over, and then all of a sudden you're in transition defense, and then they're having trouble communicating the Spurs, and that becomes an issue. So looking at their schedule of the teams fighting for a postseason spot right now between both conferences, the Spurs still have 28 games left against those teams. Against teams that are outside, but still fighting, so they're out of the playoff picture right now, but they're still fighting. They haven't called it a tanking season yet. Are 2 teams, the Pelicans and the Sixers, and the Spurs have a combined 4 games against those teams. So again, 28 games against teams in the playoff picture or battling for a playoff spot, and then 4 games left against teams that are still fighting. They haven't called it a season just yet. So that means that the Spurs only have 7 games left against, teams that are kind of aiming for the lottery intentionally. So basically like 7 games that on paper that should be a little bit easier to win for San Antonio. So again, the tough part about this is that, Coach Johnson's saying that good teams are exposing things for the Spurs on out there right now against these better teams. But the problem there is that they're going to be playing these better teams, again, 28 games of these last 39 to end the season. So they will have to make some adjustments. going forward against these good teams, or if not, to either if they do well, they're going to stay in that playing picture, keep their hopes alive of getting a playing spot. But if they don't, well, then obviously it's going to start looking. We have to start looking at where are they going to end up in the lottery. So again, this is going to be a big challenge for the Spurs in these next few weeks to see how they perform against some of these better teams, because that is one of the issues they're having, is that when they're playing these better teams, these teams are exposing things for them out there on the floor. One thing also I've noted, because I've seen this both from the Memphis games and also the Heat and the recent loss to the Pacers, is that opponents are it just seems like opponents are driving and kicking or just carving out wide open threes against the Spurs' defense. And I wanted to see what the data said, so I did do some investigating here. So if we look at opponents' amount of threes that were 60% or more than were attempted wide open. So again, the defender 6 feet or more away. Before January 3rd against the Nuggets, that had only happened 8 times in 33 games to the Spurs' defense. So basically 24% of the time it was going to happen where an opponent was going to get 60% or more of their shots wide open from 3. So again, the Spurs were doing a good job up until January 3rd of not letting teams carve them up, kind of getting a lot of drive and kick action, getting wide open threes. However, since January 3rd against the Nuggets, it's now happened in 7 of 10 games. So 70% of the time now, teams are just driving and kicking, getting a lot of wide open threes against them. And that's something that we see about, how they're having to play out in transition a lot, which is going to generate a lot of wide open threes. And that was just something that happened recently against the Pacers, where I looked at the numbers and I think the Pacers got 74% of their threes were attempted wide open, and they made like 41% of those wide open threes. So again, that has been a problem where we do see that teams are starting to carve them up and kind of get inside and kick out to wide open shooters. Yeah, so just staying on this topic of pattern of blowout losses, again, we're just going to see how the Spurs adapt or respond to this this challenge that they're having against playing some of these better teams. I don't know if they'll address this at the trade deadline. I've looked at a lot of the trade players that are out there in trade rumors, and I don't know if one player is going to specifically address all these issues that they're having out there on the floor. So it looks like more so they're going to have to just probably go into fighting these last 39 games with the roster that they have, and if not, addressing a lot of these questions more so in the offseason. Again, we'll see what they do. Maybe they do make some moves at the trade deadline here, as I'm about to talk about in the second topic. Let's keep going. All right, so for the second topic, I'm going to address this question that I had. I asked this question: should the Spurs clear roster room for next season? So what happened was, earlier this week, I was doing some I guess you could say investigating or research I was looking at 4 players on the Spurs, players that are, having either performed to expectations, or their roles changed, or they're just not getting a lot of minutes. And those 4 players were Zach Collins, Keldon Johnson, Blake Wesley, and Malachi Branham. And so what I was trying to do is I wanted to look at all 30 teams and see, who has different trade exceptions to maybe acquire one of these players. So I looked at teams with mid-level exceptions left, like the tax mid-level, the non-tax MLE, disabled player exceptions, and also teams with just trade exceptions. And I try to see, where do these 4 players, do they fit into any of these teams' salaries, to kind of get an idea if those teams could use these exceptions to acquire these players. So first off, with Zach and Keldon, I couldn't find a trade where it's just them going into somebody's trade exception because it bumps those teams at the apron level. So again, that those 2 players I scratched off the list. Next, though, were Blake Wesley and Malachi Branham. And I did find a bunch of teams that could fit Wesley or Branham into either their trade exception, their mid-level exception, or their disabled player exception. So from there, I started looking, a little bit more at specific teams that would probably want a younger player who's not getting any minutes, who still has a year left on their deal, like Wesley or Branham. And so Wesley, his salary for next season is $2.6 million. For this season is $2.6 million. So if you're acquiring him, you're bringing in his $2.6 million salary. And then Branham is his salary is at $3.2 million. So again, you're bringing in his $3.2 million salary. And so the question is, why would the Spurs want to do this? Why would they want to move either of these 2 players to another team? So for the Spurs, it's more so about how maybe these 2 players aren't in their future, going long term, going forward, because they haven't really got any minutes this season once the entire roster got fully healthy. And so for them, the Spurs, going into next season, players on guaranteed contracts, they're already going to have 13 players on guaranteed contracts. And by October 2025, you can only have up to 15 players. So basically that leaves very little room to either re-sign some of their own free agents, like Chris Paul's a free agent, Trey Jones is a free agent, Mamu's a free agent, Charles Bassey's a free agent. So if they want to bring any of those players back, there's limited room there. Plus, They want to either participate in trades in the offseason or sign different free agents out there. Again, they're going to be a little bit more restricted because they're going to have 13 players on the roster already next season with Wesley and Branham, plus their 2 first-round picks they're getting, which are their own first-round pick in 2025, plus they're going to get the Atlanta Hawks' pick in 2025. And honestly, they could be 14 players if the Bulls play better than they're supposed to and the Spurs end up getting the Bulls pick. That could be 3 first-round picks coming into the team next year, which would make 14 players on guaranteed deals. So again, for the Spurs, it's not really about getting big assets for either Wesley or Branham. They'd probably get like a pick swap for a second-round pick swap, maybe like a protected second, or maybe like the draft rights to like an international player who hasn't come over. But it's more so that would be a move, knowing that one, those players probably aren't going to be in your long-term future, and then 2, it's to clear some roster space so you have more flexibility in the off season going into next season. Now, why would some lottery teams want to acquire either Wesley or Branham? For the lottery teams, again, I don't think playoff teams will want to acquire Wesley or Branham because they're not even playing on the Spurs' roster right now. But the lottery teams would, because this is something that some of them do, is that they know their season's gone. The lottery teams are just aiming, they're trying to get their best lottery position. So they have some minutes available on their roster to give someone like Wesley a bigger role, more consistent minutes, and then basically you get as a lottery team, you get a trial period where you get to see, can Wesley or Branham turn into something if we give him, the rest of this season, like 30 games left, plus all of next season. If we give them either of those players real minutes, can they turn into something? And then if they do end up showing signs of being a really good NBA or a productive NBA player, then in the summer of 2026, you can as the lottery team or even the Spurs, you can make that player a restricted free agent in the summer of 2026. So again, that's why a lottery team might do this. Look at acquiring either Wesley or Branham if the Spurs were willing to negotiate in a trade like that. However, the problem there is that as I started looking through a lot of the lottery teams, they have the financial ability to do it, where they have the exceptions to acquire Wesley or Branham. That the one thing they don't have, though, is that they don't have roster space. So again, I think this would only happen. It only looks more realistic if one of those lottery teams participates in a trade first, and then they end up having an open roster spots. Then I could see them maybe calling Spurs and seeing, would they be willing to trade Wesley or Branham to give that player more minutes, on their team. But if those lottery teams don't make any trades beforehand and they don't end up with a roster spot before, then I don't see that that's going to happen. Because again, right now that their rosters are all full, they're not just going to waive someone, just to add a player. I don't think they would right now. So again, that's kind of where that piece came from that I wrote about. Again, you can visit that on the spotupshot.com. It was called "The Spurs and Trade Exceptions in the Upcoming Trade Deadline." I also wrote another trade-related piece called "2025 NBA Trade Deadline Players and Trade Rumors." Now, this piece is only for paid subscribers, and what you get access to is I'm daily updating this table where I have a lot of players who are in trade rumors in the NBA, not just specifically in the Spurs, but I have them in the by each conference: Eastern Conference, Western Conference, and I'm just looking at who are players that have reportedly, according to reputable reports, been on the trade block. Not necessarily like a team wants a player from another team. So like Herb Jones from the Pelicans, right? He's a player that a lot of NBA teams want, but right now, according to all the reporting, the Pelicans are resisting trade calls for him. So again, it's more so on who are the players that are available. And so in there, you can see each player that's kind of available, maybe what the team wants if it's been known in the reporting. Do they want a second round pick for this player? Do they want a first round pick, et cetera, a young player? Also, what is the player's salary, and some other information about the player. So again, I encourage you, if you haven't subscribed to the spotupshot.com, you can visit the spotupshot.com and look up that piece. It's called 2025 NBA Trade Deadline Players and Trade Rumors. And so regarding the Spurs, as of Sunday afternoon, January 26th, it's still very quiet on there, and there's been no, none of their players have been leaked in any kind of trade rumors right now. It's still been very quiet. There are still about 1.5 weeks left until the trade deadline arrives on February 6th. Looking at some news and notes that came out this past week, so Victor Wembanyama was almost named an All-Star starter on Thursday. So Wemby got close, but he wasn't named an All-Star starter. He came up second, though, in media voting ranks amongst Western Conference players. So he was second amongst the media. He was fourth, though, amongst the fans and the players voting. And so that was the big part of it, was the fact that since the fans have more control, they have 50% of the vote, the fact that Wemby was fourth, what meant that he wasn't going to jump past either Kevin Durant, LeBron James, or Nikola Jokic to get there in the starting lineup. I will just say, though, let's just say that the All-Star starters were only decided by the media. The West starters would have looked like this, and in this order. And this is important to note. It would have been SGA, who got the most media votes. Jokic, who got the second most media votes, and then Wemby would have been third, who got the third most media votes amongst Western Conference players. Then it would have been Steph Curry, and then it would have been LeBron James. But again, the media doesn't get the say in the starters. The fans do, and the players as well. And so he wasn't named a starter. But the fact that the media is holding Victor in this high regard and they see him as, one of the third best players out West is good for his case for some of the end of year awards, because the media will have control of those awards, such as Defensive Player of the Year, making an all-NBA team, and then, of course, making another all-defensive team. So, again, that's what's interesting, is that the fact that the media sees Wemby, I guess you would say, higher or more established than some of these other players that the fans and the players saw. And so that's good for Wemby's case of making some of these end-of-year awards later on at the end of the season. The All-Star starters, though, are going to be announced on Thursday. And so if the coaches, the NBA head coaches, have control of this voting, and so if the coaches are seeing Wemby like the media does, I think that for sure he's going to be a lock to get in as a reserve on Thursday. So I think Victor's name should be announced coming up this coming week on Thursday as a reserve on the Western Conference All-Stars. And then also there was some reporting, according to ESPN, that projected 2026 number one pick AJ Dybantsa said he wants to play with Wemby in San Antonio in 2026 when he enters the NBA. He's supposed to be going to BYU next season, according to ESPN. But those odds are very slim, and even AJ acknowledges that, because one, the Spurs' pick isn't going to be number one. The Spurs should be a better team next year as well, so they're not going to be have the number one pick in the lottery. They can also swap with the Atlanta Hawks next year in 2026, but again, the Hawks aren't that bad. They're going to be a good team again, so they're not going to be a lottery-bound team, or at least not a number one pick kind of team. And then the Spurs are going to get the Bulls' pick next year, but it's only in range 9 through 30. If it's 1 through 8, it stays with Chicago. If it's 9 through 30 in 2026, it goes to the Spurs. And again, if it's the 9th pick, it's not going to be AJ's number, most likely, if everything goes according to plan and he stays projected as the number one pick. So that was just interesting to see, though, that his name was connected to the Spurs and the fact that he wants to play with Wemby. All right, so before I close this episode, let's look at these upcoming 3 games for this current week, and then I will be recording the next episode on next Sunday, so a week from now. So on Wednesday, so the Spurs have had a few days off. Of course, they have to travel back to America, and they're going to have a few days off before on Wednesday. They're going to host the Los Angeles Clippers, who are 6th out West, and they are 6-4 in their last 10 games. The Clippers are going to probably want revenge, because if we go back to New Year's Eve, the Spurs blew out the Clippers on that night. They were on the second night of a back-to-back, and so the Spurs took advantage, and they really, just ran them out the building. But the Clippers, like I mentioned, are 6-4. They're playing better basketball, and they have welcomed Kawhi Leonard back to the lineup as well. So Kawhi's going to be, he might be available for that game. So that's on Wednesday against the Clippers. I'm going to go, but just because of how the Spurs are playing right now, I am going to say the Clippers win that game. On Friday, the Spurs host the Milwaukee Bucks. And so the Bucks, of course, are a really good team out East. They're 4th out East. They are 8-2 in their last 10 games. And I'm going to go with the Bucks here, because I do want to see how are the Spurs going to counter the Bucks' defensive game plan, if they're going to use a similar game plan of having Lopez kind of man the paint and then having Giannis stick on Wemby one-on-one. What kind of adjustments will the Spurs make? So since I don't know those adjustments right now, I'm going to go ahead and go with Milwaukee in this game. And then on Saturday, the Spurs have a back-to-back set this week. They're going to host the Miami Heat again, who they just lost to in a blowout about a week ago, last week. So basically, for this one, I'm going to the Heat are 8th out East right now. They're 5-5 in their last 10 games. Of course, they're going through this issue with Jimmy Butler. Is he playing? Is he not playing? Even when he played against the Spurs, though, the Heat still won. And so I think I'm still going to say Miami here, because I'm still have a question for the Spurs, which is how are they going to adjust to the adjustment that the Heat made by having Kelly Ware guard Wemby and then having Bam guard the paint, basically stay around the paint and make things tough on the Spurs inside. And then, of course, the Heat were able to get transition offense on the other end. So again, that's why I'm going with these 3 teams. I'm going to go 0-3 right now for the Spurs, but maybe they've made some of these adjustments. They're going to find some counters. And so if they do, obviously they have a better chance of getting a win. But for now, I'm going to go, unfortunately for the Spurs, it's going to be an 0-3 week according to my predictions. But again, we'll see if they defy those predictions. Thank you for taking the time to listen to this episode of the Spot Up Pod. If you like what you heard, please subscribe and leave us a rating on your favorite podcast apps and our YouTube channel. The Spot Up Pod is recorded and produced by Paul Garcia. The music for this episode was written by Vincent Garcia and Paul Garcia. Thank you for listening, and have a great day.